everybody to this, Welcome everybody to this, the fifth and final Code of Ethics webinar co-hosted by the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance and the Walkleys Foundation. My name's Percy. I'm a former ABC journalist. I'm the Vice President of the Media section of the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance, and I'm also a Director of the Walkleys Board. I'm coming to you from the land of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung people in the Kulin Nation in Melbourne's west. We have a cracking lineup for you tonight and a really great topic of discussion, one that's really timely and really important for us to have. It's entitled A Matter of Trust. And we're talking about improving integrity and accountability in Australian journalism. So let's have a look at who we do have with us today, and it really is a wonderful lineup. I think we're all pretty honoured to be here today. Peter Greste is a journalist, an author, an academic and a media freedom activist who is a founding member of the advocacy group, the Alliance for Journalist Freedom. For 25 years, he was a foreign correspondent. And of course, that is how he found himself in Egypt in December 2013, reporting for Al Jazeera, and on the wrong side of local authorities who jailed him and his colleagues on bogus terrorism charges. He spent 400 days in prison, and while in prison was awarded the Walkley Award for his outstanding contribution to journalism for his fight for democracy. We welcome Peter. Saffron Howden is a journalist and author who founded the Crinkling News, a national newspaper for young people. She's written a book teaching media literacy to children called Kid Reporter, The Secret to Breaking News. She reported for AAP as well as the Sydney Morning Herald and the Daily Telegraph, and she's currently the national news trainer for Australian Community Media, which has mastheads across regional and rural Australia. Welcome to you, Saffron. Sumeyya Illanbey is a state political reporter with The Age. Last year, she won a Walkley alongside Nick McKenzie and Joel Tozer for their exclusive 60 Minutes investigation, The Faceless Man, which led to the sacking of Victorian Labor Minister Adam Somyurek. In 2019, Sumeyya and her colleagues won a Quill Award from the Melbourne Press Club for an investigation into toxic waste dumping across Victoria. Welcome, Sumeyya. And Elias Clure is a journalist for the ABC's 7:30 program in Sydney. And he's the ABC's 2021 Andrew Olley Scholar, a prestigious award for young reporters at the national broadcaster. He's also worked in Melbourne and Darwin. And last year, he wrote a striking piece on the Black Lives Matter protests that were happening around the world and indeed here in Australia. And he wrote that from the perspective, obviously, of a young reporter of African-American ancestry with his own experience of racism. So welcome, Elias. Welcome you all. And I think you'll agree out there in audience land that we've got some great people to really nut out and get into the guts of this great discussion. So I guess I'll ask you, as I have been doing throughout this series, I do a quick whip around to each of you. Firstly, what does the Code of Ethics mean to you on a daily basis? Peter Greste.
Well, I think it forms a sort of bedrock for a lot of journalism. It certainly acts as a kind of grounding for the work that I do, but it also, I think, acts as a backstop, the kind of thing that you can hold up to deflect criticism against yourself and say, look, it's not just me, it's the Code of Ethics that I need to stand by. It externalizes it, and I think takes a lot of pressure off any of the kind of direct pressure that we might be facing when we're dealing with these kinds of issues on a daily basis.
Saffron?
Yeah, I think I agree with the sort of bedrock. I think it runs through everything we do and reminds people that we have a code that we stick by that sort of guides everything that we do, reminds people that there are limitations on what we can do, and I think that's really important. But as I hope we're going to discuss today, I think it can definitely be moving with the times and teaching us even more to reflect some of the challenges that we now face.
Sumeyya, what do you think? What happens? How do you use the Code of Ethics on a day-to-day basis?
I think for me, it's also about, just going back to the topic of this conversation about allowing the audience to be able to trust us again and building that accountability and also that trust within our audience. And just knowing that in my reporting, I try and be as fair and as honest as I possibly can, abiding by those Code of Ethics. So for me and for my audience, knowing that they can trust my journalism because I've abided by a set of rules.
Elias.
Yeah, well, in the TV reporter process, it really guides everything we do from bolt to nuts, from the moment you pick up the phone to call someone you might interview, to that interview, to the writing process, then to the presenting process. As Peter said, it really is a bedrock for every single element of the process and what we do from day to day now at 7:30 and previously in TV news.
And how would you rate, Elias, initially, the ethicalness of the Australian media right now? 1 being low, 10 being high. What's your ranking?
I would say probably a 5 in the middle. Sorry to be diplomatic, but could be better, but it also could be worse.
Sumeyya.
I think I'd have to agree with Elias. And I think one of the issues that I have, not just with rating the media, for their ethicalness as well, but unfortunately being lumped all together. There are ethical journalists, there are unethical journalists, there are media organisations that are a bit more ethical with the way that they present their news, and there are others that don't. Of course, we can absolutely always improve, but I think one of the frustrations is just looking at the media through only one lens and just casting that aspersion.
Saffron.
Can I say it depends? A little bit following on from what Sumeyya said too, that it depends on who it is and what day it is, and what topic is being covered. I think, I'd broadly sit somewhere in the middle there, but then, we've definitely got the journalists and the media organisations on the really upper end of that spectrum, and you've unfortunately definitely got ones on the lower end of that spectrum. So I think it depends. Sorry to be annoying.
No, that's been very much the way with other speakers as well. Peter Greste, what's your rating?
I'm going to be a little bit harsher than my I'm going to be a little bit harsher than my colleagues, I think. I think I've worked around the world an awful lot, and I think we are nowhere near as ethical as a lot of our colleagues are in North America and the UK and Europe. That's not to say that we are in a terrible state. I think there is an awful lot of very, very strong, very ethical journalism. But I think we've allowed the culture of competition to get in the way of a lot of really good ethical journalism generally, and I don't think that's been particularly healthy.
So we're in your ranking, 1 being low, 10 being high.
Seeing as Elias and the others sort of hedged their bets and went for a 5, I'm going to go for sort of a 3.5 to 4, I'd say. As I said, right. I wouldn't put it right down in the bedrock, but I certainly wouldn't put it in the positive side of the ledger either.
Okay, I'm going to pick up on what you're saying there. I probably agree. I think one of the issues when you look at some of the really great standards you see in some of the best UK, European and American reporting is some of the robustness within the organisations and the robustness within the regulators. Saffron, that's something you and I have discussed endlessly is, this trust deficit that's currently in between audiences and journalists. What's behind that specifically here in Australia?
I think there are a number of factors. It's obviously that's a big question, and it has a lot of answers, and that's why we've been talking about it so much. I think that obviously the internet has opened up a whole lot of new challenges, but also sort of points of contact with our audience. So we're much closer on the whole to our audience now. They can see what we're doing in real time. We've seen that with the press conferences with COVID. Journalists are being judged as they work, as they ask their questions. They're not the polished product is not the thing that the audience is seeing anymore. They're seeing the whole process, and sometimes they really don't like it. But also, I think over a number of decades, and particularly when the media has been very strong and probably hasn't had to have been very sort of sticking by its audience, there's an arrogance that has crept in, and I think a distance from the audience, which we need desperately to claw back. It's why I think local journalism and regional journalism can teach us quite a bit, because I think a key part of being a journalist is being part of your community. And I think for too long, particularly in the large, metro media organisations, we've managed to become so far removed from our audience that, well, why should they trust us? They don't know us. You know, we've sort of blithely carried on with our code of ethics and going, well, we're doing the right thing, and everyone will just believe us that we're doing the right thing. And I think we need to get back to our community, and we also need to our audience and the people we're serving, and we also need to take them on the journey with us, explain what journalism is, and explain why it's important.
Sumeyya, you've been in the press gallery there, you know, day in, day out for a lot of those press conferences with Daniel Andrews. And of course, those press conferences have been a real lightning rod for criticism, hatred, you know, a whole lot of trolling of the media because of the behaviour. What was it like to be in the midst of that?
Absolutely traumatizing. And I think I'd agree with Saffron's point where people don't normally see how this is such a cliched, overused phrase, but how the sausage is essentially made. And for the first time, people were seeing how journalists asked their question, the framing of their question, what they were asking politicians. And at the end of the day, something that we also started tending to forget, you know, as an audience as well, politicians are also incredibly polished people. They respond to questions, but they rarely answer the substance of the question. And that's what we were seeing last year as well. And I guess the other point that I sort of wanted to make was you don't see the polished product when you just tune into the press conference of that particular journalist reporting. You also don't see all of the other reporting that may potentially be going on. You know, that the political reporter might be in those press conferences just asking the Premier questions about the day-to-day news of, you know, coronavirus, what's happening, just trying to hold the government to account while balancing the need to get out public health messaging as well. And I think that's one of the things that I found last year. Not only were we trying to scrutinise the government, hold them accountable, ask them the questions that absolutely needed to be asked, which everybody agrees is, you know, a bedrock of journalism, of political journalism, but we were also trying to push out public health messaging as well. And we were using press conferences as a public health tool. And for something like the coronavirus pandemic and what was happening in Victoria last year, the two just for some reason seemed to be very incongruent in people's minds.
Peter, I want to pick up on what you were saying about what happens elsewhere. You've come back to Australia, you know, you're doing great stuff on the press freedom front, but when you see the kind of criticism that's been directed at Sumeyya and her colleagues and, you know, press conferences, for federal politicians as well, and I guess more recently with the New South Wales press gallery, what are your thoughts? What comes into your mind?
Look, I don't think that the criticism's justified, frankly. I think that as journalists, we've got to be robust, and I find it very frustrating when people respond negatively to that kind of robust questioning. I don't really care who it is that's in the chair. Journalists have a responsibility to push and push hard, particularly when they're dealing with politicians who are very, very skilled at evading and avoiding questions and delivering the message that they want to hear, they want delivered, rather than the kind of information that actually we need to be exploring and unpacking. So, you know, I get frustrated by the kind of criticism that we're seeing. I don't think. I understand. I think it's great that we've got. Excuse me. I've got automatic lights here.
We knew this was going to happen. Don't forget to put some questions in the chat, people. I'll take that advantage of the
right in the middle
lull.
of the So I think it's absolutely right that we're transparent about how we make the sausages. I just wish that the public understood a little bit more that robustness is that kind of jousting is a part of the process. Sometimes it does stray over the line, but I think that the line is much further than most of the critics have complained about.
And let's face it, if Daniel Andrews, Gladys Berejiklian and others really wanted to go straight to the public, they would have town halls or whatever. You know, for me, that was part of it. It's just like they're doing this through a press conference because they know they're able to control things to a certain degree. So I think there was a bit of disingenuousess by the politicians as well. Elias, sorry, I was just
going to jump in very quickly. That's what Twitter and Facebook are for. And if you want to get the direct, unfiltered messages, then fine, go to their Facebook and Twitter feeds. But I don't think anybody really thinks that's a great way of running a democracy if we get rid of the news conferences and rely entirely on those feeds.
Absolutely, and I'd like to pick up on that a little later. But Elias, one of the things that's happened too, and it's not just through the COVID pandemic, we've seen in recent years under Trump, the whole, it's actually more dangerous for journalists to be out there doing their job. You've got to, you stick out as a journalist, obviously. So I recall after the AFL grand final, I forget which one with Richmond, and, during a live cross, you were mobbed by a whole lot of girls. Now, that's a feather in your cap, I guess, in some senses, but at the same time, there's a real security issue there. And I'm not suggesting that was an unsafe environment necessarily, though a little intimidating, but I'm just wondering what you can tell us about being out there as a news crew where you can spend hours and hours at a location. We've had this real backlash against journalists, particularly in the broadcast media.
Yeah, well, Peter would know obviously about the dangers of being in a hostile environment, but that's more from a perspective where, the government or the people in charge of a country are targeting journalists. But now it does seem as if there is that animosity within the public. We saw a journalist for Channel 9, I think it was, in London, attacked by a member of the public, which was really, really nasty. We saw a lot of it during the Black Lives Matter movement as well. And it seems to come from both sides of politics. And what I really find is that when I'm out doing live crosses in public, that vitriol is almost like this weird sense of, they just dismiss journalists as like kind of sensationalist, I guess, and people attached to kind of corporate enterprise, this weird kind of, I don't know, there's an expression often used for that, sort of part of the swamp, as it were.
Yeah. Saffron, that's sort of misinformation, disinformation that people pick up on, and then the whole fake news thing that Trump has really did really make a lot of hay out of. Saffron, you've looked at media literacy and something that you're very passionate about, particularly for young people. But where do you think media literacy is more generally in Australia? The fact that misinformation, disinformation takes hold so quickly, and people don't seem to be willing or able to verify things, to actually go and figure out whether this is something that they should believe. What do you reckon?
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm a huge advocate of more media literacy education starting as young as possible. And I think that we're pretty far behind some other countries and regions in our approach to that, but we're catching up fairly rapidly. But I think it means that the combination of the sort of rapid flow of information on social media combined with a lack of media literacy, and we know it's fairly low levels of media literacy in Australia among adults, and actually less so kids. Kids tend to be, Gen Z is right up there with the more media literate among us, but definitely among adults, and that does allow the disinformation and misinformation to take hold. I think, though, if we look at our own industry and at journalists, we have to look at what role we play in that. And so we do this amazing job of producing a lot of, ethical, top quality journalism, which is fact checked and very reliable and reliant on, expert advice and so forth, and very balanced. And then we something happens when we get on Twitter, and all of those sort of professional standards that we apply to our work before we would file a story go out the window, and suddenly we've got journalists with just random opinions. Oh, I was getting my jab done today and it's a total shambles. Oh, I couldn't get across the border when I wanted to. Oh, this is a terrible situation. Oh, my sister's been affected by this. And for some reason our that professionalism goes out the window. And I think if we want to help the public better understand and better appreciate what we do, which I think is essential, because I think what journalists do is essential to democracy and our society functioning well, we have to start applying some of those professional standards, or maybe reapplying those professional standards to our own public persona. And that means, having a really big conversation about how you know, how much our personal branding and our need to kind of, you know, feed the social media cycle of how many, you know, likes and retweets can I get, is actually doing a lot of damage to the trust overall that people have in us, because we're buying into these arguments that I think we shouldn't be buying into.
Sumeyya, you know, what do you do when, you know, here as journalists, we act in the public interest? That's a big, important part of how we get access to politicians, how we can demand things of the courts, demand things of business, because we're acting in the public interest. But what happens when there's a backlash of this kind from the public? How do you deal as a journalist with kind of, you know, do you question yourself as to, you know, who am I representing here?
I think it sort of depends on what it is that you're facing the backlash on. Are you facing the backlash? Is it very legitimate, or is the backlash partisan? And you'll more often than not be able to tell. It goes back to the earlier points of, and this is why you need to abide by a code of ethics. And this is why you need to be able to say, have I reported this fairly? Have I reported this honestly? Have I been incredibly transparent, not only with my audience, but with my sources as well? If I've made a mistake in this story, have I been transparent enough in that story and issued a correction or a clarification at the end of that? And have I been able to own my mistakes? I think being a lot more transparent with your work and with your mistakes is incredibly important. It's everything. Society, the world in general, and I don't want to be, you know, hyperbolic or anything, but things have just become so hyper partisan and so along political lines, you know, arguments and positions and, you know, backlashes, they can sometimes be along political and partisan lines. And I don't have an answer to that, to be honest. Sometimes I just don't have an answer to dealing with public backlash.
Yeah. Peter, I want to bring you in and talk about what we're also seeing. So we've got, you know, the public demanding more, but also, you know, this kind of, we're losing some of the kind of niceties, if you like. But let's face it, when it comes to the way governments have dealt with the media, you know, we've got a real problem there. And successive federal governments have eroded the rights and freedoms of the press, you know, whether it's national security legislation, stopping what journalists can get, you know, anti-whistleblower measures, thwarting freedom of information processes, and down to just plain refusing to answer questions. To Sumeyya's point earlier about, you know, you've got these very slick political figures who are good at responding to questions, but not necessarily answering them. So how acute is the threat to press freedom in Australia right now?
Much more acute than most people really understand, I think. For a long time, we've been looking at this. When I got out of Egypt, I started to think about what had happened to us in the context of national security, the way the national security legislation had been weaponized to come after good journalism, good, robust journalism. And I realized that much the same thing had happened in Australia, not in quite the same explicit sense. Up until 2019, when we saw the AFP raid journalists from 2 news organisations, we really hadn't seen agents of the state sort of kicking down the doors of journalists. And even now, we're not seeing news organisations censored in the way that you might think in a classically authoritarian kind of state. But what we've got is a series of national security laws that have steadily chipped away at the journalist's capacity to protect their sources, to protect their own data, to investigate areas of government that we ought to be able to look at when it comes to public interest journalism. Over time, all of this stuff has been eroded, and what used to be considered as legitimate journalism is now, in a lot of respects, criminalised. And after the AFP raids, we saw 2 parliamentary inquiries. Now, those inquiries came up with a set of recommendations that I don't think really began to touch the sides of the problem. But fundamentally, what they did do was acknowledge the extent of the problem. Those recommendations ran all the way through national security legislation, shield laws, FOI, all sorts of transparency problems. And so we're not anywhere near beginning to fix the problem, but we are at least starting to have those conversations and understand what's going on.
Elias, I want to bring you in here and pick up on what Saffron was saying, and I think Sumeyya has also touched on it when it comes to community. During the Black Lives Matter protest, which was, highly divisive, there was also, I think some of the security stuff that Peter's been touching on, I think has also sort of bled into now our protest movement. We've got these quite militarised police and the rest of it. So, that I think everything looks a lot worse than it really is. But you've got a really interesting perspective on covering that, because one of the real weaknesses, I think, of our media in Australia is how we reflect our communities. Walk us through when you wrote that really striking article and what prompted you to do that.
It was all manner of things, really. It was a very emotional week for myself personally. But I mean, just the history of media diversity in Australia, I think is not great, to understate it. And, even when I started the ABC and before that in commercial radio, every story that involved people of colour or people that didn't live within 5 kilometres of the CBD was looked at from a very specific lens, and a lens that I thought pushed people like myself or the people I went to school with away. And in the lead up to that week, I was really nervous about covering that event. But as time went on, I thought, no, I really have to embrace this. And just seeing a black face on TV when I was growing up reporting a black issue would have been really, I guess, not... this would have been really comforting, I think. And I sort of thought, well, this is an opportunity for me to, as part of a mainstream media organisation, present a story that's looked at from a different lens. And that's what inspired me to firstly cover the story, and then secondly, write that piece for the website afterwards.
And it was a really striking piece. I would recommend to anybody who hasn't seen it, just do your search engine with Elias, Clure, Black Lives Matter. It's a really striking, fantastic piece. I'm going to actually go to a couple of questions and intersperse them with some of the questions I still have here, but we have a great question here about how do you define ethical journalism? What are some of its hallmarks? Saffron, let's go to you first.
I think we've probably touched on them already a little bit. So transparency is incredibly important. I think one thing that making sure that you're accurate, that you're being fair to the different people involved in the story in whatever way you're telling it, a great deal of professionalism comes with that. I think one thing that we don't talk about enough, and I would definitely put this in the basket firmly of what ethical journalism is, and I think this could be better reflected in our code of ethics as well, is empathy. And this is something we talk about quite a lot in media literacy. And I think it needs to play a bigger part in journalism, particularly if we're going to win back the trust of our communities and audience. And it's having empathy for the people that you're doing stories about, but it's also having empathy for people who disagree with you and who have a different interpretation of what your journalism's place in the world, and approaching everything we do with that. I think that's an incredibly important part of ethical journalism, and I think it's definitely not something we're seeing enough of, particularly in this current environment that Sumeyya talked about, of the sort of hyper partisan approach to everything that I think unfortunately sometimes journalists buy into. Even if it's not politically partisan, they get involved in a partisan discussion of facts, and I think coming to every story you do with empathy is, I think, a really good starting point also to improve diversity, frankly, in the way we cover things and cover stories as well.
Yeah, look, I think I definitely want to pick up on that. But firstly, I'll go to Peter. And what do you think are the hallmarks of ethical journalism? Can you add anything to what Saffron's list is?
Oh, look, I think Saffron's list is pretty solid. It's an adherence to the kind of core principles of what we do. I think there is a kind of there's a sense, certainly amongst the public, that journalism hasn't been ethical. It isn't being straight, particularly when people can Google whatever they want and discover a source that's going to directly challenge or imply that some journalist report has been biased or sensationalized or something. Again, I'm not defending every piece of journalism, but what I'm suggesting is that there's identifying good journalism in and of itself has become a real problem. I think that what we can and perhaps should be thinking about doing is radically reassessing how we define what journalism is and who journalists are. I think we ought to be considering something like a system of certification, for example, where I'm not talking about accreditation where you license journalists, but where you perhaps have something like the equivalent of a blue tick on Twitter to identify journalists who have been through a process of vetting by their colleagues and whose work achieves a certain standard. And that way, I think people might have a better sense of who to look to and who to trust. I think that would help the situation an awful lot. That way, at least, we've got a sense of setting good journalism apart from all of the rest of the stuff that you find online.
And I guess one of the other issues in the media industry is that, unlike doctors or lawyers, there's no compulsory professional development. There's no, we're kind of this ramshackle ad hoc kind of industry. Sumeyya, what would you think about a certification program for journalists?
Before I answer that, can I sort of just take a step back and just go to a point of improving media literacy as well, and just really being transparent with the public about who's an opinion writer, who's a columnist versus who's a journalist. And maybe journalists, and going to that certification, process, maybe journalists should not be writing opinion pieces. Maybe all of our published work should be either analysis that doesn't necessarily contain our own opinion, but analysing what's actually happening, either speaking to insiders or experts, and then just sticking to straight reporting. I think one of the things that gets lost is when we talk about this unethical piece of journalism or this unethical piece of work, we sort of tend to not differentiate between opinion writing and columnists and journalists who are writing up and down or straight, news stories. And maybe that's something that we need to improve as media organisations and as journalists by making that incredibly transparent and public, and also steering away from opinion writing, as in this is my opinion and this is what I think about this government, and maybe just the analysis of this is how this government's going and these are what federal MPs or what insiders are saying.
Great. I think that's a really important element. Do you have some thoughts on self-certification or a registration certification system for journalists?
Haven't given that too much thought. Well, how is, how...
No, don't get Peter started on that. We'll be here all night. But I do encourage you to read Peter's thoughts on this, because it is a really interesting process and an interesting idea. I'm just going to pick up on some of the comments in the chats at the moment. So we've got a comment here about one of the barriers to journalists getting out and about is to build trust is the 24/7 news cycle. Now, this person, I can't quite read your name because it's truncated in my, but is that, the Media Code of Ethics consider the ethics of taking enough time to report properly and avoid journalism. I'm not sure that would be the right mechanism for it, but I do think that's a real issue. And look, I'll go to Elias, I think, on this as somebody, as a fellow ABC, I'm former ABC, I'll always be an ABCer. Yeah. The pressures on news journalists in the ABC, and I know it's everywhere at the moment as well, but breaking stories, radio, online, TV, across, there's that journalism that is required everywhere, but the pressures that puts you under to, so can you talk us through that a little bit, Elias, about how you deal with those pressures to make sure you're doing the right thing? Because that's something that you have faced on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all the old-timer journalists tell me that, now that the pressures on journalists to do more with less has never been as significant. And I think through that, we're seeing what Saffron said earlier was really interesting about empathy, because I feel as if some reporters on the road, when they are under pressure to deliver a 2-minute news package amongst doing crosses and writing for online, sometimes that empathy just goes out the window. They just want to get the story out as quickly as possible, which is unfortunate. I remember I was privileged enough to speak to someone who lost their parents in a really nasty murder, and she said to me that the thing that gave her the most nightmares was the cameras flashing in her face after court. And I think sometimes we forget that as journalists. The other thing as well, in a really competitive environment where we're doing so much more within the space of an 8-hour day, is that news directors back in the office will be watching the 4 and 5 o'clock news, particularly of 7 and 9, and be calling up their journalists saying, why don't you have this line in there? Why don't you have that? So we see journos on the road really trying to leverage answers out of people so they can get the most salacious answer possible. And certainly I've probably been guilty of that. I'm thinking, okay, I need to get this grab. I need to get this piece of vision without thinking about, you know, my responsibility as a journalist.
And look, one of the reasons we've been holding these seminars and these webinars is to try and really prompt a discussion out there. I'm also going to just take a comment here. I think, Sue, I can't quite read your last name. Apology, I've got a truncated chat there. But I'm often asked by students, what happens if you breach one of the MEAA standards? The Media Entertainment Arts Alliance, the Code of Ethics, have 12 separate standards, as well as being honest and being fair and being balanced. And look, in reality, the sanctions can only be against a journalist who is a member of the Media Entertainment and Arts Alliance, who is actually held to that, because people can make a complaint, there's an investigation, and there might be sanctions. But, you know, in reality, I don't know a journalist who is a journalist who would say, I don't abide by the Code of Ethics. So, you know, that's a really important question, I think, for members of the public certainly to be asking, is just like, do you, okay, even if your journalist is not a member of the union, and everybody should be a member of their union, particularly the Media Entertainment Arts Alliance, because we're so fabulous. That's my spruik for today. But, you know, you should be asking is, like, do you abide by the Code of Ethics? So, yes, the policing of the industry is really problematic, Sue. You know, there have clearly been some issues with the Press Council. There's clearly issues with ACMA, which is the broadcast body. You know, we really need to have regulators with teeth that still recognise the importance of freedom of speech, etc. So that's an answer there. Now, we've got another question here about Saffron mentioning the importance of community media, but also saying that the idea of Peter's certification process might discredit or maybe disadvantage some of those outlets who don't have the same access. Peter, we'll just briefly go on about that, because I know this is your real passion, but I just want to, if you can touch on it briefly, how it might work.
No, look, I think quite the opposite. I think that it would actually empower them. What we're talking about isn't anything that would exclude anybody who is able to produce journalism. One of the problems is that there's an awful lot of journalism-like content out there, but that isn't produced to a rigorous standard and that isn't subject to a complaints procedure, which is, I think is absolutely crucial and cuts back to what you were just talking about, the issue you were talking about a moment ago, Karen. And so anybody that is working as a journalist, I think, can go through a certification process to submit their work and demonstrate that they hold to a set of ethical standards, that there is a complaints process that they abide by. There's a whole set of standards that they can be measured against, and once they've achieved that, then they get that little blue tick. And I don't really think it matters where they come from, who they work for. Journalism shouldn't be restricted to an exclusive group of individuals who work for big news organisations.
Saffron, given what's going on in community, in regional and rural, news organisations, where we've now got news deserts, where there's little or no media coverage in some parts of Australia, how do you, given the concerns and the problems with the business model that we have at the moment, the old, everybody advertise with the local media and that's how you paid for journalism, that's gone, particularly difficult for regional and rural. What do you think are some of the steps needed to ensure a viable, sustainable media sector, particularly in regional rural Australia?
Now you've come on to my favourite topic now. So now you're never going to shut me up.
Yeah, I will. I've got the microphone. I can silence if I need to.
Look, I think it is one thing that in this discussion that we need to sort of address, and everyone on this call works for different people, is employed by different people, but it is something that we need to face the reality of, and I think we need to do it head on in a very public way, is that competition that I think Peter referred to right at the beginning of this discussion really sets the tone for how we approach journalism and how it's seen publicly in Australia. And because we're such a tiny market, really, because we've got such a small population, the various media organisations in Australia are fiercely competitive. And that draws in the individual journalists who then work for those organisations. And unfortunately, it creates these sort of sometimes ridiculous sort of demarcations, so that, you know, if you work for the competition, then in no way will I ever countenance anything you ever do being good journalism. And I think where we need to come together, and this applies to rural and regional as an industry, and we need to put aside the competition that exists for funding and advertising dollars and for audience views, is on the very heart of journalism. So accepting that all of us agree that this is really important, and that's why we're all in this industry, and it's why we're journalists, and forming an alliance around that. It's one that crosses those commercial and competition boundaries. And I think part of that then would enable us to do what it's been successful in some other countries, particularly the US, to join forces on things like media literacy that would assist us all. And then in the sense of making people realise the importance of the role of journalism. And so then would encourage people to appreciate quality journalism. We can also work together to talk to government about different ways of funding journalism. And you know, during the pandemic, we saw France, you know, offering tax breaks to people who took out subscriptions to newspapers. We're just not very far down this path in Australia. We're still sort of, most people are just clinging on to the tiny bits of audience they can hold on to that haven't left for Facebook yet. And I think when we look at things like rural and regional journalism and journalism for smaller groups, for niche groups, for kids, for instance, we need to absolutely look beyond the model that we've been dealing with over the last, you know, however many decades. And that's going to involve a mix of philanthropy and public funding. And it's going to involve, you know, some sort of people forking out money. But we need to have that discussion, and we need to have it as an industry. We're not going to solve this problem at the very heart of what we're talking about tonight if we don't come together on some of these issues.
Sumeyya, I want to talk to you about, you started your career, as I understand it, in a kind of, you know, one of those amazing local papers that there used to be so many of, where you were on the local beat, where you had to know what was going on in the neighbourhood. That's kind of an area that's really been lost. How important is that local journalism to communities?
Absolutely, incredibly. And all of the other adjectives that go with that, to be honest, just connecting people to their local communities. And we talk about the death of regional and rural journalism and media and newspapers. And absolutely, that is a massive issue. But one that tends to get overlooked a lot is the death of community newspapers, newspapers that connect people to their local communities, that actually allow neighbourhoods to thrive and to prosper. And keeping local governments to account, for example, there are so many suburban councils with absolutely no oversight. The schools that are there, you know, as I said, the local governments, the hospitals, the train, all of these are incredibly important elections. And as we know, decide elections here in, you know, Victoria and Australia as well. People were absolutely enamoured by the promise of car parks from the federal government. The Victorian Labor has won two elections, you know, won a landslide on their promise for level crossing removals across suburban areas in the southeast. So these all need to be scrutinised. All of these issues need to be, journalists need to shine a spotlight on these particular issues and on these particular sore points in communities as well. And one of the things that we saw with the federal election especially We didn't even know what people on the ground were thinking. We didn't know what someone in Berwick was thinking, because there aren't very many local papers there or any local journalists there. So it's incredibly important to actually understand what the issues are and to be able to reflect that in our reporting.
I think one of the issues too, and I think somebody's picked it up, it might have been Saffron, about the lack of media diversity. That's partly the small number of organisations that are here, but also, you know, frankly, the fact that our media sector does not actually represent our community. I want to bring you in here, Elias, because obviously that's something you feel really strongly about. What difference does it make when, you know, when you as an African-American heritage man is reporting on Black Lives Matter? What's the connection? What's the difference? Why does it matter?
Well, I think I said in the piece, it's like, you know, you're a former court reporter, Karen. You know, you could probably write a fantastic story on the AFL Grand Final, but a sports reporter could do a much better job. And that's how I feel about it. It's you giving a perspective and a point of view that perhaps wouldn't otherwise exist, that background understanding into a story that perhaps someone that didn't grow up Black in the Western suburbs has. I think that's so important. And it could apply to all range of different issues within society, but you're right. When you have a very kind of homogenous newsroom, you can't really provide the, I guess, diversity in coverage of issues that the audience is expecting. And particularly when I started, I didn't see that at all. It was the homogeny within newsrooms resulted in the homogeny within the actual news people were reading and seeing on television.
Sumeyya, what's your experience been?
I think for me, I haven't covered, you know, been a state political reporter, so I haven't necessarily had to cover something like Black Lives Matter, but just to pick up on Elias's point as well, it's not only just the diversity of views that you bring, but it's being able to bring that nuance to the table as well. I remember when I first started, this was at the end of 2018, there were 3 people who were arrested in Melbourne's northern suburbs for terrorism-related offences. And we had journalists scouring through, you know, their Facebook pages and also their father's Facebook pages. And there was a flag that looked like an ISIS flag. So there was a report being prepared about how the kids' family were ISIS supporters. It wasn't an ISIS flag. You know, the kid's father was talking about the caliphate, but they weren't talking about the caliphate as in the ISIS caliphate. They were talking about it in a very different context. If we had written a story to say these people who've been charged with terrorism offences, their family are also adhering to ISIS, 1, that is defamation, but 2, being able to bring that nuance and also that understanding to, you know, things aren't as black and white as they seem. There is a lot of nuance and there's a lot of diversity to issues in, you know, in different communities. And for me, it's also about just understanding, like, you know, I grew up in Melbourne's northern suburbs, really being able to understand the issues there as well. Throughout the coronavirus pandemic, we saw how, you know, the virus essentially swept through Melbourne's north and west, and just understanding some of the issues there, understanding some of the barriers people might face, and really being able to hone in on that, question that, and just sort of ask, are these things being considered? Is the government considering all of these things? Are we reporting on all of these things? And really understanding how the virus, you know, it exposed fault lines essentially in our society. And as someone who grew up in Melbourne's northern suburbs, you know, I had an intimate and a first-hand understanding of what that meant and how that affected. Oops.
Just on that quickly, Karen.
Yeah.
I've on what Sumeyya is saying, I interviewed someone recently actually in the west of Sydney, and they told me there seems to be this implication from people within the media that we can't speak English. And that's exactly what the nuance is. It's just like, okay, there's some people that live out there, predominantly Middle Eastern, or in this area, predominantly African. They mustn't understand the rules as well as us white people can. That's why the coronavirus is spreading there. And again, I think that's why diversity in the media is so important, because people like myself and Sumeyya can say, actually, they can speak English. It's just that the rules are bloody confusing, you know, or they're essential workers and they
haven't done a proper translation job. They've got the wrong,
exactly.
You know, so yeah, there's a whole lot of problems. I think that's a whole discussion on itself. Quickly, Sumeyya, if you want to just throw in a quick last word on that one.
Oh, no, I was just going to say what New South Wales, you know, like the casual workforce, the casualised workforce, it was an issue here in Victoria. We were able to understand it, report it very quickly, and it was something that New South Wales didn't really understand too long into their pandemic second wave.
Yeah, that's right. They sort of tended to wait as if nothing had happened down here to sort of instruct anybody anywhere else. It was an odd one. And Daniel's made a bit of a comment here about how he's a local journalist in Berwick, no less, that journalism tends to be a bit cliquey. And when he speaks to people on the ground, which local journos do very well, I think you're right there, Daniel, that people feel that journalists are unreachable and elitist. And I would often privately agree with them. Would the panelists like to weigh in on how that reputational view can be changed, given it weighs into that ongoing issue of trust in journalism and faith in reporting? I might go to you first, Saffron, because I think we have this kind of contradiction where social media makes the audience, you know, up close and personal to some degree with journalists. But I do agree. I think there's still this whole kind of like, well, we don't have to listen to you. What do you reckon?
I think Saffron's dropped offline for a moment. She's got some audio issues. I think she's about to reconnect.
Oh, good job, Peter. Would you mind picking up on that one? Did you get that? Like that. I think you've got this sort of contradiction where social media makes journalists more accountable, or you know, accessible to some degree, but there is this feeling that journalists are elite, that they, you know, don't feel that they're answerable. Is there what do you see as a way to bridge that gap or bridge that contradiction?
Yeah, look, I think I am also inclined to agree that there does feel as though there's a greater gap. I'm not sure that social media, a greater engagement on social media is really the answer. I don't think that's really quite what they're talking about. I actually tend to think that diversity is actually a part of that problem, because what we see on our screens is not what we see in our communities out in the streets. It's just not. I've just been looking at a survey a study from 2020 that showed that about 75% of all of the presenters on television news services had Anglo-Celtic backgrounds. That is not what Australia is. We're much more diverse. We're much more colourful than we see on screens. And I think unless we're able to really reflect what Australia is actually like on our television screens, we're never going to be able to connect. It's very difficult to give a specific answer to individuals, to explain or to say this is how you need to behave to connect. I do agree that I do accept that there's a sense of elitism. I don't think elitism necessarily in and of itself is a bad thing. You know, it tends to push people into higher standards, but that doesn't mean we should be disconnected from the communities that we're covering. And I can see that that's definitely an ongoing problem.
And look, I think one of the other issues is the work intensification that has happened in the media sector because of the collapsing business model, the fact that there are so fewer of us. So that whole get out and about and make your contacts, go for the coffee, go for the beer, just go and hang around is not out there anymore. You know, it's hard. You know, TV crews don't get sent a long way sometimes because it's a huge kind of impost, or you worry about what's going to happen. I want to pick up on something that Luciano has had to say, and we're in the kind of last 4 or 5 minutes here. Luciano talking about that there are a lot of language papers other than not English that are, he seems to see them as sort of upper class public relations. So there's not really inquiry, not investigative journalists. It's kind of just maintaining good relations. What can be done about that? I guess one thing is, Luciano, demand that they be a real newspaper. But Saffron, that's something that is sometimes directed at newspapers in the regions and rural, is like, where is the balance between ensuring that you're being a newspaper, but also supporting your community? Because as you and I have discussed before, in regional you know, when you're reporting on something, you are right in there with your audience. So you've got to really balance that having a nice relationship and being part of the community and being supportive, but also having that role as the watchdog as a journalist.
Yeah, and look, I think it's a really tricky one, and I think it's one that we all sort of, I also think it's a good problem to have, because if you're close enough to your audience, to your community, that you are going to get direct feedback pretty much on your journalism, then I think that is a great problem to have, because it means you're interacting with your audience and that you're part of your community. So it's really good. I agree, though, that it is a really big tension. It does tend to happen much more to local and regional journalists who will write a story about someone one day and the next day be behind, you know, standing behind them in line at the local shopping centre or filling up their car with petrol in the same place. You just don't have that distance from your audience that you do in the big metropolitan newsrooms. I think that's where things like a code of ethics become incredibly important, and being really open with your community about how journalism works. Going back to what Sumeyya said about how the sausage is made. I am part of your community as a local journalist. I care about it. This is why I do this job. But I can't write a story as a mouthpiece for you. I serve my community and your community best by being fearless and independent and professional in the way I approach this. And I think, you know, if you're sort of if you're committed to that journey as a local news outlet and as a local journalist, then that can actually be a really inspiring and an engaging way to be a part of your community and to serve your community as a journalist as well.
Peter, I'll come to you. What do you think we can do to put the public back into public interest journalism? If you could be quick, because I'd like everybody to do a bit quick whip around on this one before we wrap.
Yeah, you've been talking a lot about business models. One of the problems is that we unfortunately, we're serving our shareholders, our owners, we're serving often our own paychecks. And it's perfectly understandable in an environment where the finances are so shaky. I think if we could restructure and rethink how we finance journalism, put some public money back into all commercial journalism in some way, then we'd be much more accountable to the public, we'd be serving the public.
Great stuff. Sumeyya, what do you think can be done to put the public back into public interest journalism?
Instead of maybe having a certification model, policing the industry better, you know, maybe having a more robust press council. The joke in the industry is journos are more afraid of appearing on Media Watch than they are of, you know, being referred to the press council.
Elias.
I think all of those answers are great, but I just wanted to add understanding, and this comes from the top down, understanding what the core business is and really who our audience is and what they want, rather than the most salacious thing that us journalists might think are important.
Saffron, I'll give you the last word.
I think we need to, you know, despite what we're discussing tonight, I think we need to stop making it about us and make it about our audience. I think we spend a lot of time building brands these days, and it's about our personal names that go with it. Certainly when I entered the industry, you know, you were a fairly anonymous, you know, bit of, you know, byline. No one ever really knew who you were, and it was more important what your story said. I think we need to come back a little bit from the celebrity status of journalists and put our audience and our community at the forefront again.
There are a number of questions still that I'm just going to let go because we are right out of time, but I want to, if you can virtually put your hands together for what was a really cracking discussion with a really top-notch group of panelists here. This has been a really great discussion, and as I say, this is our fifth and final Code of Ethics discussion, but we've had some really wonderful guests talking very frankly about the industry. And look, I encourage you, for those of you who joined tonight who might not have seen some of our others, if you go to the Media Entertainment and Arts Alliance YouTube channel, we are putting these forums up there, so you can go back and have a listen to some of the others as well. The Walkley Foundation will also be posting them on its website as well. So a special thanks to Marcus Rowie. He's been behind the scenes, who hasn't actually been seen by anybody but the panelists, who's done a really fabulous job through these 5 Code of Ethics webinars. And thank you very much, Marcus, for doing that. For offering technical support throughout this. We also have been collecting the $10 you've paid for this has gone to the Media Safety and Solidarity Fund, which is a fund run by MEAA to assist journalists in need. And over the past year and a half, there's been COVID, but of course we've seen the situation in Myanmar and now of course in Afghanistan. And while the money primarily goes to the Asia Pacific and the Asia region, we know that a whole lot of journalists from Afghanistan are either in Pakistan or trying to get to Pakistan or elsewhere. So the money is going to a really great cause. We've raised, I think, somewhere in the order of $2,500 over these panels. So thank you to everybody, the panelists who've allowed that to happen, for those of you who've tuned in as well. And if anybody's a Walkley Award applicant, don't forget you've got to get your applications in by, I think it's Tuesday. So for those of you who want to get your applications in. But otherwise, thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you so much for everybody who's listening. We will say good night.